They have not delivered the rapid increases in productivity and in working class wages that neoliberals like me, that we would have confidently predicted had we been told back in 1993 that Mexican exports would multiply fivefold in the next 13 years. That if you told me back in 1993 that NAFTA will pass and Mexican exports will expand fivefold over the next 13 years, I would have said, well, that's done. It's clearly going to be a wild and extraordinary success, and Mexico is going to be a richer and more developed country significantly come 2006 than it is back in 1992. And the stakes matter. The stakes matter a lot because economic systems that are perceived not to be working, that are perceived not to be generating kind of greatly increased prosperity, are enormous sources of political danger. That at the working class level, the existing inequalities and hierarchies seen in society, if they have any justification at all, they can be tolerated only if the system works. And the system works in the sense of bringing the country and its people's standards of living close to the relatively high and prosperous level that it's obvious that countries can achieve in the world today. And from the perspective of elites, kind of the game of increasing democratization, of playing by the international rules and domestically playing by the rules of free elections, rule of law, respect for property, but also respect for the political demands from the relatively poor for redistribution. These also seem to turn on a relatively rapid degree of economic advance. That is, elites can play three games. They can play the game of we own property and collect rents and profits and recognize that we have to pay a share of that for downward income redistribution because we live in democratic states under the rule of law. They can play the game of rigging elections and extorting wealth from everyone who has to deal with the government. They can play the game of death squads. Elites all over the world play these three games, and only when economic progress is relatively rapid is there a chance that they can be convinced in a stable fashion to keep playing the first, the good game, the positive sum game, rather than the other. Now you look at Mexican politics today, and even with the great doubt, to say the least, about what the real outcome of the last presidential election was, there have still been great improvement in political openness and in political competition, since the heyday of the PRI's rule back in the 70s and 80s. But how long will this remain stable? A faster growing Mexico seems to be a precondition for long-run stability. So here I sit in 2006, having confidently recommended 13 years ago a program of neoliberal openness and for Mexico's economic development. It's scratching my head because the first two stages of it seem to have been secured. That is, NAFTA passed, yes. Rapid expansion of the Mexican exports, yes. Political opening, as Mexico's elite seems to want to act more like a North American elite in terms of willingness to accept the rules of the democratic game, yes. But where's the payoff? Where are the benefits to the median Mexican of this shift to neoliberal policies? And why haven't they shown up visibly? And, there are at least four potential answers I can give. The first answer, and this I owe to Michael Kremer of Harvard and Brookings, is that those of us who in the early 1990s were talking about the benefits of export-led development and about how more countries should adopt export-led development strategies focused on increasing their openness and integration with the world economy, that we overlooked one thing. Now, admittedly, it's kind of hard to overlook because it has 1.3 billion people. people and sits there just across the Pacific. And if you go down to the port of Oakland, let alone Long Beach, you can see its economic impact coming in every day in container ships piled 5 high. But the one thing we overlooked was China. That Michael Kremer's argument is that in any generation there is only so much space for export-led development, right? Only so much space on the sofa. And, you know, in the 1970s there can be space for Southern Europe and Japan and the East Asian tigers, and they can all sit comfortably on the sofa, one in each of the 3 seats. But, you know, China takes up 5 seats all by itself. If China is sitting on the export-led development sofa, there's no place for anybody else to do anything other than watch the U.S. price of their goods they make fall and try to figure out how can we reduce what we pay our workers a little more so we can stay competitive with this extraordinary thing going on across the ocean. And that first answer is that, you know, we neoliberals gave Mexico exactly the wrong advice about when to jump onto the export-led development merry-go-round. There is a moment not to. It's when China is about to stand up. And that's certainly one possibility. I haven't quite been able to make the numbers right, but that's simply one possibility, that we were idiots and failed to understand how fast China would successfully grow, and what this impact would be on export-led development from countries like Mexico. Although in our defense, we can say this was just in the aftermath of Tiananmen and the kind of collapse of China into another era of revolution and political struggle seemed more likely than did the extraordinary economic boom that's been accomplished over the past 13 years. So that's the first from China. The second is, you know, demography, the demographic burden of Mexico's rapid population growth. That Mexico has not yet made its way through the demographic transition. And when it is the case that you have to find space for 2.3% more people every year, you know, more houses, more highways, more infrastructure, more education, that simply the burden of sustaining that rate of increase of your capital stock simply to hold yourself constant relative to your rapidly growing population, that makes expecting rapid economic growth unlikely, that a lot more would have to go right altogether, and that we cannot expect Mexico to see significant increases in average standards of living until we go down another generation and see the birth rate drop a little bit more, right, as it will, as it always has. And once Mexican native population growth is down to 1 or 1.5%, all of a sudden a great deal of investment will be able to go into making workers more productive rather than equipping workers equipping workers with kind of the capital they need to survive and the infrastructure and housing that they need to live. And that all we need to do is wait. That we promised the coming of the neoliberal kingdom inside a decade, and it will actually take a generation or two because the demography has to work itself out. And the third possibility is, so for that second one, our problem was we overpromised. That is, as indeed people like Rudy Dornbush and Paul Krugman were warning in the early 1990s, that the rhetoric associated with the so-called Washington Consensus, unquote, was greatly overstated, and that policies, while good, would be unlikely to produce anything like the buzz around them. And, you know, Paul Krugman is still around, and I promise to listen to him more carefully in the future, because he was right. Rudy Dornbush, alas, is not still around. But this is yet another sign that I should think in the back of my brain, what would Rudy say? Because he was very wise about this as well. So we have China, we have demography. We have third, that we were simply focusing on the wrong things. Right? That you look at the economic deficiencies that still abound in Mexico, and you see an extraordinarily low average numbers of years of schooling. And more important, with young workers having almost no more formal education than their older counterparts. We see little on-the-job training, in large part because of low schooling. That transplant factories from America are running at Detroit or Cleveland or St. Louis kind of levels of staffing because good workers are still remarkably hard to find. And so the possibilities of having a more employment-intensive manufacturing to boost real wages in Mexico as kind of factories start up there isn't really coming to pass. Heavy bureaucratic burdens on firms, corrupt judges on police, high crime rates, a low productivity informal sector that narrows the tax base, although it contributes to the incomes of local functionaries. But these deficiencies should not have been enough to neutralize Mexico's powerful geographic advantages and the potent benefits of the policies that Adam Smith recommended 230 years ago, should they? Well, they may have been. They may have been enough. We may have been wrong to focus on trade and to have been much better placed to focus on education and corruption. Right, to have told Carlos Salinas de Gortari and company they shouldn't focus on how they can integrate with North America so that all their friends can easily move money from Mexico City to New York and back again. But instead, they should have focused on getting teachers who know how to teach and aren't just the feckless cousin of the local party boss who needs a job, right, into the schools. You know, that a much more social democratic, social investment agenda might have served Mexico much, much better. And so that's part 3, right? That's simply building up the social and educational capital. That maybe that was the key link to Mexican development rather than increasing trade. Certainly there's every reason to think it is the key link now. That if only chunks of the Mexican school system that had the potential of the Malaysian school system or the Thai school system or the Chinese school system, then we might well see lots of things going much better in Mexico. And the fourth possibility, is just that we were right after all. That things are just taking longer than we expected. Right? And things are just taking longer than expected because the policies that make Mexico an attractive place to produce for export require a lot of changes that you can't just be produced by waving your hands. That the process of building up infrastructure, building up trade links, building up knowledge links, building up transportation links, that's going to be a long process, and that Mexican exports have quintupled over the past 12 years. It tells us that the process is starting, and we shouldn't be expecting to see that the back of the train has not yet started to move, because the train is very, very long. But we neoliberals can at least be confident that the front is moving. And since we have our faith inherited from Adam Smith, the back of the train is still connected to the front of the train. That if I come back in another 5 or 10 years, I'll be much more optimistic, perhaps as optimistic as I was 6 years ago. That might be true, but it's not. It's an excuse. It's not something I'd bet on. Having witnessed Mexico's slow growth over the past 15 years, I'm shaken. I really don't know what to think. I don't know what the right policy options would have been for the U.S. in 1993 vis-a-vis policies for Mexico. I don't know what the right development strategy for a benevolent Mexican government that wanted to unwind the pre-PRI's domination of Mexican politics and society would have been. In fact, I don't know what the right development policy for a benevolent Mexican government that wants to see Mexico become free, democratic, and prosperous would be today. And there, having raised 90 zillion questions and